What does the world's greatest Sumerologist say at the very end? After 50 years spent reading the oldest writing humans ever made, Samuel Noah Kramer could read clay that no one else alive could touch. Grain lists, king lists, a flood older than the Bible, all pressed into mud 4,000 years before him. For most of his life, other scholars called his ideas crazy. So why did the same experts who doubted him spend the next 30 years quietly proving him right? If you want the real story behind the oldest records on Earth, the ones most people never get to hear about, hit subscribe. I cover forgotten history and the people who cracked it every week. Long before the awards, before the books that changed the field, Kramer was a poor kid in Philadelphia who had no idea what to do with his life. He was born in 1897 in a small town in the Russian Empire in what is now Ukraine. His family ran from violence and arrived in America with almost nothing. Young Sam wandered. He tried writing, he tried teaching. Nothing held. Nobody looking at him in those years would have guessed he was about to spend the rest of his life talking with people who had been dead for 4,000 years. Then he found cuneiform. Cuneiform is the wedge-shaped writing the Sumerians pressed into wet clay with a cut reed, then dried hard or baked in an oven. It is the oldest writing system we know of, older than the alphabet, older than Egyptian hieroglyphs in their full form. By the time Kramer sat down with it, the Sumerian language had been dead for about 2,000 years before Rome was even built. No native speakers, no dictionary handed down. Scholars had to rebuild the language from the inside out, sign by sign, guess by guess, checking each reading against the next tablet to see if it still made sense. Kramer was better at it than almost anyone who ever lived. What he was best at was not the famous tablets, it was the broken ones. A single Sumerian poem might survive as a dozen broken pieces scattered across a dozen museums on different continents. One corner in Philadelphia, the middle in Istanbul, an edge in a drawer in Berlin that no one had looked at in 40 years. Kramer's gift was matching the breaks. He could hold the memory of thousands of clay pieces in his head, see that a chip in one museum finished a crack in another, and piece together a 4,000-year-old text the way you would piece together a torn-up letter. He was not guessing at meaning and calling it translation. He was reading, one wedge at a time. One story shows exactly how this worked. Kramer rebuilt a Sumerian poem about the goddess Inanna going down into the land of the dead, passing through 7 gates, losing one piece of her power at each gate until she stood in the underworld with nothing left. For years, the poem broke off near the end. The clay was simply gone, and no one knew how it ended. Then another piece turned up in another museum, and it carried the ending. Inanna is allowed to return, but the dead demand a price, a stand-in, and she must send someone down in her place. Kramer fit the new piece into the old break, and a 4,000-year-old story finally finished its own sentence. That was the work, not guesswork, repair. In the late 1930s, he spent long stretches in the basement of the Istanbul Museum, working through Sumerian story tablets that had sat unsorted since they were dug out of the ground. Most visitors to that museum walked right past the cases. Kramer went into the back rooms, where the plain, dull stuff lived, and started reading the oldest stories ever written down. What he found there became the argument of his life. The Sumerians, he kept saying, were not backward people scribbling down silly beliefs. They were record keepers, driven, exact, careful record keepers. The same scribes who wrote down how many sheep a temple owned also wrote down the deeds of their kings and the acts of their gods, in the same writing, with the same plain, exact care. Kramer made a simple, bold claim about that. He said, we should take it seriously. He laid it out in a book in 1956 with a title that sounds like bragging until you read the proof. He called it History Begins at Sumer. In it, he listed dozens of firsts. The first schools, the first written law, the first recorded wise sayings, the first love song, the first record of a man putting his case to a court. All of it pulled straight off the clay, not myth, paperwork, the leftover records of the world's first cities, saved because clay does not rot. But here's what comes next, and it is the part that still does not sit easily even now. The same drawers held the other stuff, the creation stories, the stories of gods who walked among people, the lists of kings who ruled before the world we know. And those came from the same hands, in the same writing, stored on the same shelves as the grain receipts. Kramer's quiet, dangerous idea was that the Sumerians themselves drew no line between the two. Take the flood. In 1872, a self-taught scholar named George Smith was working through tablets at the British Museum when he saw he was reading a flood story. A man warned by a god. A great ship, the waters covering the world. A bird sent out to find dry land. It was the story from the book of Genesis, except it was written on Babylonian clay hundreds of years before the Bible existed. Smith was so shaken that, by the stories from back then, he started pulling at his own clothes in his excitement. A flood story older than scripture, carved by hand, sitting in a drawer. That was the Babylonian version, from the Epic of Gilgamesh. Kramer pushed the story back further still. He worked on the Sumerian flood story, older than the Babylonian one, where the survivor is not Noah and not the Babylonian hero, but a king named Ziusudra. The Sumerian text tells how the gods decided to wipe out humankind, and one god warned a single good man to build a great boat and ride out the disaster. A piece of that tablet sits in the collection at the University of Pennsylvania, marked as CBS 10673. The scholar Thorkild Jacobson later gave the whole story a name. He called it the Eridu Genesis. Then there is the Atrahasis epic, put together in 1969 by the scholars Wilfrid Lambert and Alan Millard, which tells the same disaster from a different angle, with the gods sending the flood because humanity had grown too crowded and too loud. And in 2014, an expert at the British Museum named Irving Finkel shared a tablet that gave building plans for the Ark itself. According to that tablet, the first ship was not a long boat at all. It was round, a giant woven basket boat, sealed with tar. Same flood, same warning. Older and older the deeper you dig. 4 different stories, one event, all of them treated, by the people who wrote them, as something that happened. Now hold that thought, because the king list is where it gets really strange. There is an item in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford called the Weld-Blundell Prism, marked as WB444. It is a 4-sided clay block covered in cuneiform, and what it holds is the Sumerian king list. The list does exactly what it says. It lists the kings of Sumer, city by city, in order, with how long each one ruled. For the later rulers, the numbers are normal, a reign of 30 years. A reign of 6 years. Kings we can sometimes match to other records and other stone markers, real men. But the list does not stop at the normal kings. It keeps going backward, past the flood, into a stretch of rulers it puts before the waters came. And those reigns are not counted in decades. They are counted in tens of thousands of years. One king is said to have ruled for 28,800 years, another for 36,000. The list runs through 8 of these kings across 5 cities, and then comes a single line, the flood swept over. And after the flood, the list says, kingship came down again from heaven, and the numbers shrink back down towards something human. Most scholars read those huge numbers as a tall tale, or as a counting system we do not fully understand, or as a way of saying the deep past was just impossibly old. Fair points, all of them. Kramer knew them, but he kept coming back to the detail those answers skip over. The Sumerians did not file the impossible kings in one box and the real kings in another. They wrote them into the same list, in the same hand, with the same care, as one unbroken record. To the scribe carving WB444, the king who ruled for 36,000 years and the king who ruled for 30 were the same kind of fact. Most people never hear that part. They hear the big numbers and laugh and move on. Kramer spent his whole career refusing to move on. And it connects to one of the strangest parts of the whole Sumerian record. The Sumerians believed that civilization itself was given to them, not made, given. Before the flood, according to their stories, 7 sages came up out of the waters to teach humanity. They were called the Apkallu. They are described as half fish, wrapped in the skin of the deep, and each one handed over a piece of the groundwork, writing, law, math, the skills of the city. This same story comes down to us through a Babylonian priest named Berossus, writing for the Greeks hundreds of years later, and it shows up in temple ceremonies where the 7 sages are named one by one. The first of them is sometimes called Adapa, the one who brought wisdom to humankind. These sages were not remembered as far-off gods. They were remembered as teachers, named people tied to certain kings and certain cities, the way you would remember the person who started a school. Mesopotamian priests kept saying their names in temple ceremonies for thousands of years, long after Sumer itself was gone, as if the debt still needed to be remembered. The Sumerians, in other words, wrote down that everything that made them a civilization arrived from outside, all at once, carried by teachers who came before the flood. and they wrote it down not as a made-up tale, but as the start of their schools, their courts, and their cities. If you are learning something from these records you did not know, this is the kind of work that takes years to dig up and seconds to bury again. Subscribe so the next one finds you. Pull back for a second and look at the shape of the whole thing. A flood the Sumerians treated as history. A king list that runs straight from the impossible past into the past we can check with no break. A story that says knowledge itself was handed to humans by beings who came up from the deep. Kramer spent 50 years inside that stuff, and the longer he stayed, the less comfortable he was filing all of it under the word myth. Because there is a problem at the start of Sumer that the textbooks tend to walk past quickly, civilization there does not creep up slowly. Writing appears, and within a few short generations it goes from simple tally marks to full written stories, law, and the study of the stars. Cities appear, organized government appears, it is fast. The earliest clay tablets, from around 3300 BCE, are not stories at all, they are records of goods. Marks for sheep, jars of oil, amounts of grain, scratched into clay so a temple could keep track of what it owned. Pictures, more or less, of things being counted. And then, across only a few hundred years, that counting system turns into a writing system that can carry a love poem, a court case, a song of praise to a city, and a record of a flood. Nothing else in the human story makes that jump so quickly, from a storeroom list to a library, fast enough that the Sumerians themselves seem to have noticed and made sense of it the only way they could, by saying it had been handed to them. This bigger question of where Sumer came from did not stay with careful scholars. In 1976, a writer named Zachariah Sitchin put out a book called The 12th Planet. Sitchin took the same texts Kramer had spent his life reading and claimed that the Anunnaki, the Sumerian gods, were flesh and blood aliens from a hidden planet he called Nibiru, who came to Earth, made humans by changing their genes, and built the first cities. The book sold hugely. It started a whole new kind of book. Let me be clear about where that stands. Sitchin's translations have been thrown out by nearly every trained expert who has looked at them, including the scholars in Kramer's own field. The exact words he leaned on do not say what he claimed. Nibiru, in the actual texts, is a word tied to the movement of a body in the sky, not a hidden homeworld. The case for ancient astronauts at Sumer, as far as the experts are concerned, does not hold up. That is the standard answer, and it is a fair one. Kramer never backed any of it. He was a language scholar to the bone, and he would have had little patience for translations that twisted the grammar to fit an answer. But this is the uncomfortable thing, and it is the thing he kept coming back to in his final years. Sitchin and Kramer were reading the same tablets. The wild version and the careful version both started from the same fact, the fact Kramer had built his life around. The Sumerians swore they were writing down real events and real teachers. Kramer thought you reached the truth of those records by reading them more carefully, not by making up spaceships. The choice to call the strange stuff myth, he came to say, was a modern choice. It was a label we stuck on so we would not have to treat it as a true account. The Sumerians had used no such label. That idea seemed small when he first nudged at it. It was not. Some of his fellow scholars worried about exactly that. Drawing a straight line from the Sumerian gods to real history, even carefully, fed the very fake science the field was trying to hold back. The careful answer, the one Kramer and scholars like Jean Bottero and Thorkild Jacobsen worked toward, was not that the gods were aliens. It was that the Sumerians saw their world as one where the holy and the everyday record were not separate things at all. The flood, the kings, the sages, the temple lists, all of it was one unbroken record of what they believed to be true. A second piece of proof backs this up, and it is the least flashy and most convincing proof of all. It is the plain, everyday way the writings were stored. The great myths were copied out by schoolboys as writing practice, kept in temple libraries on shelves next to the account books, sorted in lists that named them by their first lines the way we would list songs by title. The people who kept Inanna's journey down into the underworld treated the text with the same plain office care they used for a receipt. Decades after Kramer first argued it, scholars who came forward to sort those lists proved the pattern he had held to for 50 years. The holy and the everyday paperwork lived on the same shelf. What Kramer showed, in the end, was not a hidden message and not a buried code. It was simpler and harder than that. He showed how to read what was already in front of everyone. He spent 50 years saying the oldest written voices on Earth were telling us about their world in plain words, in their own way, and that the job was to listen instead of deciding ahead of time which parts were too strange to count. If he had stopped at the firsts, at the schools, and the wise sayings and the love songs, he would be remembered as a great record keeper of the ancient world and nothing more. He did not stop there. He kept reading into the parts that made other people nervous. And the work is nowhere near finished. This is the detail that should keep anyone up at night who cares about this. There are hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets sitting in museum drawers around the world right now, dug up, logged in, and never read. Some collections have not been fully sorted in over 100 years. The number of people on Earth who can read Sumerian well has never been more than a few dozen at any one time. Best guesses put the total number of cuneiform tablets pulled out of the ground at more than 500,000, and only a small part have ever been published. Whole sets of records wait in storage for a reader who may not exist yet. Every one of them is a voice that stopped speaking thousands of years ago, sealed in baked mud, perfectly kept, and silent only because no one has opened the drawer. Kramer spent his whole life pulling stories out of that pile, and he barely scratched it. So picture the old man one more time, the way he spent his last years. Magnifying glass in hand, a tray of broken clay in front of him. A language dead for 4,000 years opening up under his eyes, one wedge at a time. He died in 1990, 93 years old, still working, still reading the dead. He never claimed to have found a secret. He claimed something stranger and quieter, that there was no secret. That the record had been sitting in the open the entire time, in plain writing, waiting for someone patient enough to take it at its word. The tablets are still there. The drawers are still full. And the oldest voices we have ever found are still saying what they have always said, to whoever is willing to read them carefully enough to hear it. If forgotten history like this is your thing, you need to see what I am covering next week. The 1872 find that proved a flood story older than the Bible, and the man who nearly lost his mind reading it. Click the video on screen now.